Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today's topic for our screencast is going to be the Supreme Court. So it's really, at this point in our class, a branch of the government that we really haven't discussed. We've been talking about the presidency, George Washington, John Adams. We're going to start to talk about Thomas Jefferson. But in our class, really all three branches of the government we have to kind of go into some depth with, and we really have to understand the role that they play. So we're going to start to talk about the significance of the Supreme Court in American history. We're first going to take a look at is just kind of the design of the Supreme Court. So what you're looking at here is the current Supreme Court justices that sit on the bench as of now. Uh, and so the first thing you want to keep in mind, now we have 9 Supreme Court justices. That number has changed, so that is not defined by the Constitution. So we've had presidents after this that tried to, it's called pack the court and add justices. So early in American history, the Supreme Court ranged from 6 justices, and then it kind of expanded all the way up until 9 justices. Now, as far as the design of the Supreme Court, what you want to kind of keep in mind, first and foremost, the most important thing I think to know about the Supreme Court is that it is not an elected position. So Supreme Court justices are appointed. They're appointed by the executive branch. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Second thing to keep in mind is that since Supreme Court justices are not elected, they also keep their position for life. And so if you look at our Supreme Court justices, you can see that a lot of them are advanced in age. Once you become a Supreme Court justice, unless you die while you're a Supreme Court justice, or you decide that you want to quit the job, or you're too physically sick to do the job, you remain a Supreme Court justice for life. Now, this is an important concept. This is done on purpose by the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers did not want the Supreme Court to be held to the whims of the political atmosphere of the era. Because they don't have to get elected, they're kind of insulated, and they can make decisions that are not swayed by the political party that's in power at the time. Because if the president had the power to revoke Supreme Court justices, if they decided on a court case differently than the president's ideology, they would just kind of be removed from office. And so those are the two important things to remember about the setup of the Supreme Court. Now, what we're going to talk about today in class is the first major part of the Supreme Court, our first major bench in the Supreme Court, which gets named after John Marshall, who is the Chief Justice at the time. So this becomes known in history as the Marshall Court. And John Marshall is going to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835. So a very long tenure as Chief Justice. And he gets to kind of shape the court with his beliefs, with his ideology, and he plays a big role. Think of John Marshall kind of like, for the Supreme Court, the same position that George Washington played for the executive branch. George Washington kind of got to set up traditions, really set the role of the executive branch and the role that it was going to play, because it's loosely defined by the Constitution. The same thing is true of John Marshall and the Marshall Court. They really define what the Supreme Court does in American history, and they define kind of the role that they're going to play and how they're going to interact with the other branches. So John Marshall himself and his background is very important because it shapes the whole Supreme Court and its interaction with American government, the states, the other branches of government. So the first thing you want to keep in mind and you want to know about John Marshall is that he's a Federalist. And so, like other Federalists, he's a loose constructionist. He believes in the elastic clause and kind of expanding the Constitution and expanding government's power when it's necessary. So he believes in a strong central government and that the states should be subservient to the law of the federal government. So that's very important to understand. This battle between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, it's going to rage in the executive branch over who becomes the president. It's going to rage in the judicial branch with John Marshall and like different states challenging laws of the Supreme Court. And it's going to rage in the legislative branch. So it goes into all facets of American life. And really the argument that's taking place here early in American history is a battle between the power of the central government versus the power of the states. And we saw that under the Articles of Confederation. They gave much more power to the states and a very weak central government. They tried to correct that with the Constitution, but it doesn't mean that everybody was on board, right? We had the anti-federalists who were fighting not to ratify the Constitution because they thought it was giving the central government too much power. And so that battle is still taking place. Now they're just using the Constitution to kind of back up their points of view. Okay? So remember, John Marshall is a federalist, and he believes in those federalist principles of kind of having a stronger central government, loose interpretation of the Constitution. So the first important Supreme Court case happens very soon after Marshall becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this is what we would call a landmark Supreme Court case. So this is the Supreme Court case is Marbury versus Madison, one of the most famous cases in American history. I can almost guarantee to you guys that this will be on your New York State Regents exam. The AP exam is a little bit harder to predict, but this case has been on basically every single Regents exam for the past 15 years. Okay, so it's a landmark Supreme Court case, very important Supreme Court case. So we're going to go through what happened in the case, and really the most important thing to remember about Marbury versus Madison is the significance of it. What did it mean for the judicial branch, for the country, for the role that the Supreme Court plays within the country? Okay, so in order to understand this case, we have to get a little bit of background here. So the last time we talked in class, John Adams was the president, and he was elected in 1796. Now, that was a bitterly contested election, and he went up against Thomas Jefferson. So in the election of 1800, the same thing is going to happen. It's going to be John Adams going up against Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. Now, again, it's a very, very close election, but if you look at this electoral map here, a few states that went to Adams in the election of 1796 are going to fall to Jefferson, and it makes all the difference. So New York falls to Jefferson, and so does part of Pennsylvania. And so that really is going to kind of shift power, and it's going to shift Jefferson into being elected. Now, in history, the election of 1800, Jefferson refers to it as the Revolution of 1800. So I'll make sure I write that down because this is very important. So we don't. If you're interested in this, I did another screencast about the election of 1800. So if you're interested, I would check it out. It goes into a lot of detail about the importance of it. We're just going to cover it briefly here to understand Marbury versus Madison. But the election of 1800 is the first time in American history that we change political parties. So Jefferson refers to it as a revolution. Like he sees like he's being the champion of the common people. He's coming into office and kind of has the like the stamp of approval of the average American. And he thinks it's basically like they believe in his ideology and believe in his ideas, and that's why he's getting elected. Now, the significance of this, I think the big significance of the election of 1800 is that we changed political party hands as far as the presidency is concerned. The Federalists were ruling under Washington, really from 1788 all the way to 1800. Then the Democratic Republicans take over. Now, what I think is important about this is that in a lot of other countries, remember, we're a brand new country. We just had a revolution not 20, 25 years earlier. Think of the French Revolution. Think of what happens in the Russian Revolution or in South American revolutions. When one party or one group of people, one faction, have to give up their power, they cling to that power like it's their life, like their lifeline. They won't give it up. And civil wars break out. Civil wars break out in the French Revolution. Civil wars break out in the Russian Revolution. In a lot of the South American countries, civil wars break out and they end up with dictators. Adams loses, and he does not like try and rally the Federalists to fight and to keep power in a violent way. We change hands from one political party to the next, which I think is a very big deal and can't be overlooked. Now, what this kind of area here, the lame duck period, what I'm referring to here, so the election takes place in November. We have presidential elections in November. Now, in the current system, you get inaugurated in January, the end of January. In this time period, you get inaugurated in March. That period between the election and then when the new president comes into power, Um, that's a very interesting period. At that time, it's very long. It's about 6 months long. So if you're a president and you've lost the election like Adams did, you still have to rule the executive branch for the next 6 months. Now, in this case, this is referred to as a lame duck period because Adams knows he's lost. So it's kind of like you're like a lame duck, like you like one leg broken, or one wing broken. People know that you're out, you're going out. So it's very tough to get laws and things passed because they know you're on the way out and you've lost the election. So what Adams does as kind of like a last minute thing to try and influence the government, although they don't fight, he does try and keep Federalist influence in the government. So he's going to appoint what becomes known as midnight judges to it's not the Supreme Court he's uh, appointing judges to. It's just like local like circuit courts and other smaller federal courts that he's appointing judges to. So it's 16 in total. And so all these people are Federalists, and he kind of puts them into these different positions. So he makes these appointments. Now, becomes very important because when Jefferson comes into office, he does this. Why they're called the midnight judges is it's the last minute. It's basically like the day before he leaves office, he makes these appointments. And he kind of leaves it on the presidential desk for Jefferson and Jefferson's Secretary of State, which is James Madison, to deliver these appointments. Now, when Jefferson becomes the president, his Secretary of State Madison, they decide that they're going to refuse to give these people their positions. So Adams granted these Federalist judges these positions in like local and lower federal courts, and Jefferson and Madison decide, well, we're not going to give it to them. We're the new executive branch or executive leaders, and we're not going to give them their appointments. And so this is when it becomes a Supreme Court issue. One of the people who's supposed to get his position, which is this guy, Marbury, right here. So he's supposed to be one of these federal judges. He sues James Madison because he's the Secretary of State, the guy who's supposed to grant him his position. He sues Madison, and this becomes the famous Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury just wants his federal judgeship. He wants to get his position. Madison doesn't want to give him his position. So you have politics, partisanship kind of at work here. Now, this is where Chief Justice John Marshall comes in, and he makes a huge decision for the Supreme Court and really shapes the Supreme Court in a huge way by doing it. What are his choices? Well, one, he can rule in favor of Marbury. And he could say, like, you must give him his judgeship. Now, in that case, he feels like it's going to make him look weak, that it's going to basically make him look like he's siding with the Federalists and he's playing partisan politics here. He could side with Madison and say, like, you can't give him the judgeship. Again, he feels like that's going to kind of put him in a weak position. And so, like, he decides actually not to do either of these things. And this is a huge part of the case. And this is the significance of the case. What John Marshall decides here establishes a principle called judicial review. Instead of siding with Marbury or siding with Madison, he does neither. What he does is he declares the judicial act that Adams used to appoint these judges. The actual act is not that important, but it's the Judiciary Act of 1789 and then 1801, which is the ones that he uses. He says those acts were unconstitutional. And so by doing this, he actually increases the power of his branch of government, of the Supreme Court and the judicial branch of government. It gives the Supreme Court a brand new power which they did not have, and this is huge. From that point on, it sets a precedent, a legal precedent. It gives the Supreme Court the ability to declare laws or acts by the federal government unconstitutional, which most Americans, I think, believe that that's in the Constitution, that the judicial branch can do that, and it's not. It's not in the Constitution. So Marbury versus Madison establishes this ability for the Supreme Court to declare laws either constitutional or unconstitutional in regards to the federal government. And this is a huge, powerful step for the power of the Supreme Court.